Hello, CICC. This is Michael Anderson here, and we're about ready to discuss the update to the 2025 weekend planning. And I first want to begin with thanking you for taking the time to, because if you're here, you read the voice. So thank you for reading the voice. And then also thank you for taking the time to watch this video. The change in weekend frequency and planning, location, etc. It's a big decision, and I'm sure many people have questions. Why do we make the decision? What were we looking at? What does this mean? Type of thing. And if you're thinking that, thank you, because that shows just how much you care for the Cursillo movement and the CICC. What I can assure you is that this decision was not taken lightly by the Secretariat, but there were a lot of things to consider, and this does not need to be a permanent decision in terms of just having one weekend for men and one weekend for women. But it's a good time to do that for a lot of reasons. So let's jump in. I'm going to share my screen here. And voila, here we go. We get my menu off here. Okay. See if we can move this. All right. So before we even began talking about the plan for 2025, we always have to remind ourselves of our priorities. So priority 1 is increased candidate participation on weekends. Priority 2 is increased participation of the Cursillo community. And then number 3, let me get my video in here just in case it shows up on yours. Number 3 is further development of the School of Leaders. So those are the priorities that we mapped out in June of last year for the Secretariat, and these continue to be our priorities today. Before we began there's some really tough questions that we need, or questions that we need to ask, some harder than others, but then we also had to challenge our direction, make sure that we're going the right direction. And so some of those questions include, as members of the Secretariat who have made Cursillo their apostolic vocation, can we acknowledge that our time and ability to serve Cursillo is finite? And as much as we all want to say, yes, we can do everything, we can tackle anything, and we want to dedicate all the time that we have to do it, the reality is we all have a limited amount of time. It's only 24 hours in a day, 7 days in a week to begin with. But even then, all of us as volunteers, we have obligations and commitments. So it matters where we spend our time, as we'll see. And so that's the next thing. Where are we as a collective Secretariat spending the majority of our time as it pertains to Cursillo? And then lastly, where are you as a member and volunteer of the Secretariat spending the majority of your time when it comes to Cursillo? And so what you might be thinking is, I bet the Secretariat is spending a significantly more or greater percentage of their time on the weekends, and you would be right. Just if we took our monthly Secretariat calls, we're always talking about weekends. It is the one consistent, and it takes a lot of time. Are we asking the hard questions? So as we think about weekend planning and some of the data that we're going to see, do our individual preferences about weekends resonate with candidates today? For example, I went to St. Bernadette's. I stayed in a room with a lot of men. I don't know how many it was, but there was a lot of people there. Before the time of CPAPs, by the way, and it was a loud evening trying to sleep in there. Now, does my preference about that resonate with candidates today, whether I like it or didn't like it? It probably doesn't resonate with everybody, not even my own demographic, but in different demographics. People have different experiences and different preferences. Number 2, do our individual preferences do our individual preferences about weekends make it hard to change, even when changing back to what Cursillo was intended to be? So there's a lot mixed up there, but I am pointing out that if we think about 2019 and going back to what the Cursillo method originally was hard for many people. Ornaments have been placed on that tree. If you followed along with the School of Leaders, you know what that means. And going back to the way the method is supposed to be implemented was hard. So we can only imagine that changing timing, changing locations makes it hard. We have our individual preferences, and we have to make sure that we acknowledge that they are individual preferences. Have our collective CICC preferences resulted in a routine or habit that is hard to change. For example, if you ask, which I've done, if you ask people, why do we have our weekends in the spring and in the fall? Nobody really knows the answer, like when the decision was made or how it was made. But what we do know is that once it was made, we kind of got into a routine. People kind of liked having 2 in the spring, 2 in the fall. They're close to one another, so we could leverage our resources together, and it just became habitual. And yes, that makes it hard to change. As everybody knows, it's hard to change habits. Our font is off a little bit, but one other element that we have to acknowledge is that the CICC, Central Indiana Cursillo Center, is unique. It is, to my knowledge, the only Cursillo center where we've had 2 dioceses merged into one: Indianapolis Archdiocese and the Lafayette Diocese, which has resulted in a large landmass, as we're going to see. So does that matter? I think we're going to see that it does. And then lastly, are we heading in the right direction? These are questions that we need to ask ourselves as we look at this data. One thing to note, our priorities talked about increasing participation in the new cursistas and the existing cursistas, right? It does not have a number target for the number of new male or female cursistas that we want to bring into the movement. It does not have a target number of weekends. So we got to ask ourselves, are we heading in the right direction? Has our weekend focus, 2 in the spring, 2 in the fall, inadvertently skewed our time? It has. We talked about that. Have we continued to acknowledge challenges in the pre-Cursillo and post-Cursillo? You've been on School of Leaders when we've had work of the sections. You would know that we've talked about that. You would also, you may not know, but we get lots of feedback, and we talk about it during our secretariat meetings, and we've gotten consistent feedback over the years that our sponsorship needs to improve, or that our friendship group reunions, we need to get more people into friendship group reunions, make sure people are finding group reunions to be a part of. Ultreas aren't happening in every parish. Those are opportunities too. So we talk about these challenges over the years, but we've not had the resources or the focus to actually address them. And that is very much true. And then, has the quantity of weekends and candidates resulted in quantity over quality as it pertains to the whole movement? And has it inadvertently resulted in burnout? And it answers yes, it absolutely has. And I think it's hard to hide from the quantity over quality, because we always talk about numbers for the weekend, but we don't talk about the quality. We talk about the quality of the weekend, but we don't talk about the number of people who are still in the movement 1, 3, 6, 12 months after the weekend, 18 months, years, etc. So those are the questions that we were challenging ourselves with, to make sure that we make the right decision, or the best decision for the CICC community. And then here's just data that we've gathered over the years. Spring weekends often conflict with school spring breaks. Everybody knows that. In the past few years, schools now have adopted fall breaks, which contend or challenge our fall weekends, and that's a newer revelation. Candidate participation appears to be declining. We're going to look into this. Cursillo community participation at closing seems to be declining. And then we don't seem to be reaching the younger demographic. That's an observation. I don't know that we have data to prove that, but it certainly seems clear when looking at our weekends. Requests for single rooms due to personal preferences are increasing. It's true. We got people who have sleep apnea, don't want to share a room. We have people who don't sleep well. They don't want to share a room. Some people just prefer having the comfort of their own room. And then there's also the COVID variable, where people just aren't as comfortable sharing a room. Like in the case of the St. Joseph's, maybe they don't want to share a room with 4 to 8 people. Facility requirements continue to change due to various reasons or conditions. That's very much true. Facility costs continue to increase. So I was blown away at what I spent at the grocery store just the other day. That's not just at the grocery stores. Everybody knows we are also seeing increased costs at our facilities. Something else that's very challenging is weekend availability is tightening. That is the reason why we're in Fatima in the fall, is because we did not have availability at St. Joseph's. And that's good for St. Joseph's and good for Terry and good for the diocese. people are using their space more. We want them to use their space. They have targets that they need to hit in order to keep these places open. They can't just keep them open and empty for us as much as we'd love it. They need to be busy too, and that's good for them. And then what we've also observed too is community Presidio community participation has declined in traditionally very active areas such as Richmond and Columbus. So what does the data tell us? Well, we talked about declining participation of cursistas. Is it true? And the answer is absolutely. This data was pulled going back to 1999. The data set seemed very clean back to that point of all of the new cursistas that attended a weekend. And you can see we have a downward slope going back to our algebra days. And so we have a declining slope. And what's really interesting is, declining slope. Since 1999, we've only had 5 weekends where we had 30 or more candidates. The last time we did was 2013. And weekend number 109, we had 33 candidates. Why does that matter? Well, it matters because we always plan to have 30 candidates for a weekend at the secretariat level, which impacts costs. And so it's a big deal knowing that we've only had 5 weekends going back to 1999. It's also worth noting in 2022, we did cancel a weekend. We rescheduled it, but we didn't have the numbers to pull off a full weekend. We don't want to do that. Nobody likes that. So for our data geeks like me, the minimum number was 13, maximum was 33 over this period of time, and the average 23.7. We're going to come back and talk about this red dotted line here in just a second. But for those who want to guess, that was around 2013, 2014. There's a pivotal event that happened around that time. Were you wondering about women's weekend participation? Well, here it is. It's also declining. The slope of the line, the decrease is not as great as it is for men's, but yet it's still declining, and we have to acknowledge that. Now, since the spring of 2000, we've had 10 weekends where there were 30 or more new cursistas or candidates going back to that time. So 10 weekends versus the 5 for men. And kind of cool, this past weekend with Becky Rice and the team, they had 30, so they just did it, which is outstanding. But again, we can't ignore the trend is negative. So the minimum number of attendees for the women has been 17, the max 36, average of 25.7. So that's 2 more, exactly more than the men. Now, let's talk about this red dotted line that appears in the men's and women's. Well, the first thing I want to point out is if we remove this data after the red dotted line and we throw a trend line in there, it's going to be flat to positive for the women. And you know what? Probably the same for the men, or slightly negative, maybe, but I think it can be positive. And so all of these weeks, so what that means is after this pivotal event, participation rates really declined. So what was that pivotal event for the men's and the women's? It was the closing of St. Bernadette's. After St. Bernadette's closed, we moved the weekend to Anderson and then into Tipton. And we have had fewer participants on the weekends since that point, that period of time. Just data that's talking here, nothing else. We've had fewer participation. The decline or the slope of the line has gotten more negative after that period of time. So let's just acknowledge it. All right. When you look at the map, here is the map of our diocese. I drew it, not to scale, certainly. It's crude, but it works. What I've done is I've mapped out, all right, where is St. Joseph's? Right here. Where is Fatima? It is right here. And where is St. Bernadette? So that's right here. The reason why we're talking about Fatima is because we are having a weekend at Fatima in the fall. I just need to point that out. So we're going to have that in the fall, and we're going to talk about it for next year too. All right, what are these purple pins right here? This is the Lafayette Diocese, and this is the Indianapolis Diocese. And then we map out Logansport, Richmond, and Columbus, because from my perspective, these are the communities that have been very active. We've lost a little bit of activity from each of them, but maybe most considerably for Columbus and Richmond. And so the question is, does moving out of Indy, does that affect our diocese and participation? And the way that it would affect that, I mean, everybody would agree that the facilities at St. Joseph's were certainly nicer than St. Bernadette's. What is the impact to overall time commitment? So we looked at this. In purple, we have St. Joseph's Retreat and Conference Center. In the blue, we have Fatima. And so what we've done is we've looked at what's the round trip drive time. And this is done using Google Maps. Our closing time, we just assume 2.5 hours for both Fatima and St. Joseph's Retreat Center, because by the time you get there for the closing, you attend the closing, it's about a 2.5 hour ordeal, but it's consistent for both. So it doesn't matter. If you think it's less or if you think it's more, it doesn't really matter, because it would be the same impact to both. And then our total time, which is the sum of your drive time plus closing time, is total time. And so, for example, the Lafayette Diocese, in order to drive to St. Joseph's, attend the closing, and drive home, that's 4.7 hours. So you might be thinking, well, geez, what would the impact be? Certainly, it would be significant to change that and go to Indianapolis. Well, the round trip drive time from the diocese is 2.3 hours. To add to the closing time of 2.5, it's 4.8 or 0.13. And if you look at your calculator, that's 8 minutes. So it's 8 minutes longer to drive to Fatima than it is to drive to St. Joseph's Retreat and Conference Center. Okay, so that's Lafayette. What about Logansport? What about the Indianapolis Archdiocese? What about Richmond and Columbus? Well, the short story is the impact of going to Fatima is significantly greater for Logansport. It's going to add on more than an hour. If you go for the Indianapolis Diocese to drive to Lafayette or to St. Joseph's instead of Fatima, that adds on a little bit more than an hour. For Richmond, it adds an hour to drive to St. Joseph's. And for Columbus, it adds more than an hour, significantly more than an hour, to drive to St. Joseph's than Fatima. So, like, what's all this mean? Well, there's some of us probably who are thinking, well, I would drive 24 hours straight without sleeping in order to attend a closing, and we appreciate you for that. Might be others who'd say, I'd walk uphill in a snowstorm to do it too, and we appreciate you for doing that. But the reality is we're not just talking about one time. We're talking about 4 times a year for closings. If it's a sponsor, that's at least one closing that you're going to if you're not attending all of them. And if you're a team member, that also affects things. And so what I don't think anybody has done consciously is said, you know what, that's far away. I'm not doing this anymore. I think the motivation to participate declines, and whether that's attend a closing or even the motivation to sponsor, because we've added on more time. And think about it too, if you have to drive to St. Joseph's Retreat Conference Center, we're talking about, for Richmond, that's nearly a 6-hour ordeal. For Columbus, it's 5.4. Like that's a real time commitment on Sunday afternoon, 4 times a year or more. You're hungry when you leave that event. If you're in St. Joseph's, and this could be a good thing or bad thing, depending on what your preference is, but there's not a lot of restaurant options in Tipton for people to eat after a closing. And it's a little thing that just makes it a little less comfortable for us and a little harder to do. And in a world where we have things that are pulling us in a lot of different directions, it's a little harder to do. I think that decreases our motivation over time. And I know people, they say, well, Michael, I would drive 24 hours without sleeping, wouldn't even stop to get gas in order to attend a closing. We appreciate you, but I don't know that it's the way that everybody feels, as much as we want them to. So now let's look at the facilities. And again, we're talking about Fatima and St. Joseph's because we're going to Fatima in the fall. We've been going to St. Joseph's. We know these places. It takes a lot of time to find out, like, to research and get costs and try to forecast what would it cost for the CICC, what would it cost for a team member and a new cursista. All of that takes a considerable amount of time. So for this exercise, and because the availability window is closing, we're only focusing on St. Joseph's and Fatima. So a couple of things, single rooms and double rooms are available at both locations, but at Fatima, they don't have triple rooms and quadruple rooms available, which can be an advantage or a disadvantage. Got a little error here on the slide, nothing like that for the video, so that this is going to be around forever. But we're talking about the maximum number of attendees. That would be 153 at St. Joseph's and 84 at Fatima. So we have more than enough space. Both places have chapel, royal room, conference rooms. Something else that's changing here in 2025, probably 2024 too, is food can no longer be brought in by kitchen chas and prepared at the locations, even at St. Joseph's. So that is a new change. Businesses, conference centers, all these places have different pressures. And this has always been the case at Fatima. It's now the case at St. Joseph's. And so the food will now be prepared by the facility. And so while it stinks that we won't have the kitchen chas there all weekend, we still will need volunteers to come and distribute food during the meals, just as they always have. So there is still an opportunity to be a part of the weekends during the meals, and we're going to need lots of them. Something that's unique about Fatima is that there's not enough parking for a closing, and so we're going to have to do that down the street at St. Matthew's Church. I've been there quite a few times actually for high school retreats. And it's really it's easy to do. It'll be great. Just a little bit different. We got to figure out the logistics and all that. And the good news is Tom Semeka and a small team are going to work on figuring that out for us before this fall of 2024 weekend. So when you take everything together, from the data, declining participation rates, due to multiple different things. We're not getting as many attendees as we used to. We have longer drives. And then a big one, and that is availability, which has already affected us. Think about it. We have a weekend coming up at Fatima in the fall. Why is that? Because of availability issues at St. Joseph's. And again, I'm happy for Terry. I'm happy for St. Joseph's. That is terrific because their capacity, and the diocese and archdiocese, they both need to see business coming through those facilities in order to keep them open. And so as much as we'd love to think they're keeping open for us, the reality is they need to use that capacity consistently throughout the year. And we're happy that they're able to do that. And so that just means we got to think differently and change. And to be honest, as I go back to this map too, I love the idea of having one in the north and one in Fatima to see if we can't reach the northern part of the CICC and more central part of the CICC. And so it provides a good option. So that's why we're moving to one men's and one women's weekend in 2025. And again, I really appreciate you for hopping on this and watching this video with me. I know you care. It's one thing about the CICC. We have a large group of committed individuals. And, we wouldn't be here today without those committed individuals. And that's what's going to take us into the future as well. So I am really grateful to each of you for spending time here. And if you ever want to reach out to me, my information is on the website. You can find it. Don't hesitate to do so. But hopefully you can kind of see that the data and the observations and the weekend and everything, all that taken together, that's what's resulted in this change. But the caveat to all of this is we need to make sure that we are taking the time as a secretariat to work on the whole movement. So there's things like sponsorship and ultras and all of those things. That's a commitment the secretariat needs to make, and we have, and we will hold ourselves accountable. And we want you to do the same to make sure that you see some improvement in each of those areas and some changes in there, so that we can address the whole movement, not just the weekends. So thanks for your time. Thank you, Loris.